Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow a Japanese soldier who kept fighting a war that had already ended alone in a Philippine jungle for 30 years, loyal to an emperor who had long since surrendered. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. There is a jungle somewhere in the Philippine archipelago, dense and breathing and very old. The trees grow close together there, their roots tangled in the dark earth like the fingers of sleeping giants. The air smells of wet leaves and deep soil and something older still, something that has not changed in a very long time. Tonight, let that jungle hold you. Let its stillness and its green shadow settle over your breathing. There is a story waiting inside that forest. A story about loyalty and time, and what it means to believe in something so completely that the world outside simply ceases to exist. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. Let the forest begin. Part 1: The Island at the Edge of the Known World. Imagine, for a moment, a map drawn in 1944. It is a military map, printed on thin paper, creased at its folds, marked with elevation lines and river crossings and the small notations of men who were trying to survive. On that map, there is an island in the central Philippines called Lubang. It is not a large island. Perhaps 30 kilometers long, no more than 10 across at its widest point. It sits in the Sibuyan Sea, surrounded by green water that turns silver at midday and deep blue by late afternoon. The interior of Lubang Island is covered in jungle. Not the clean jungle of movies and travel brochures, but true tropical forest, layered, humid, alive in ways that can feel overwhelming to someone unfamiliar with it. The canopy above is thick enough to turn midday into a kind of twilight. Below the canopy, the undergrowth is dense and grabbing, full of vines and thorn plants and roots that rise from the earth at odd angles, as if the trees themselves are uncertain about the ground. Birds call from places you cannot see. Insects fill the air with a low, constant hum that after a while becomes indistinguishable from silence itself. This is the island where Hiroo Onoda arrived in late 1944. He was 22 years old. He had been born in Kainan, a small city in Wakayama Prefecture on the main Japanese island of Honshu, in 1922. His family was not aristocratic, but they were people of education and principle. His father was a schoolteacher. His mother was a woman of quiet but unshakable conviction. He had grown up in the orderly world of pre-war Japan, a world of clear duties and clear expectations, a world in which loyalty to one's superior and to one's nation was not simply a virtue but the foundation of one's entire identity. Before the war reached him, Onoda had worked briefly for a trading company and had begun to develop an interest in the wider world. There is something quietly poignant about that, when you consider what came after. Here was a young man with a natural curiosity, someone who might, in another era, have become a businessman or a traveler, someone who might have moved through the world with openness and adaptability. But the era he was born into had other plans for him. He was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942. After initial training, he was selected for something more specialized. In 1944, he was sent to the Nakano School, an elite military intelligence training academy that had been established in 1938. The Nakano School was unlike any other military institution in Japan at the time. It did not train soldiers in the conventional sense. It trained intelligence operatives. Men who could live behind enemy lines. Men who could survive in isolation, gather information, conduct guerrilla operations, and endure psychological conditions that would break most people. The curriculum at Nakano included not only military tactics and fieldcraft, but psychology, languages, propaganda, and something that would prove essential to Onoda's future, the philosophy of never surrendering. The philosophy was not simply bravado. It was rooted in the Bushido tradition, the code of the samurai, which held that death was preferable to the dishonor of surrender. But the Nakano school took this further in a specific way. Its graduates were trained to understand that they might be cut off from their units, that communications might fail, that circumstances might place them in situations where they were entirely alone, with no contact with the chain of command, no way to verify orders, and no clear understanding of what was happening in the wider war. In those circumstances, they were taught, a soldier's duty was simple: continue the mission. Trust in the orders you were given. Do not surrender. Do not lay down your arms. The mission continues until the commanding officer personally relieves you of it. Those teachings would become the architecture of the next 30 years of Hiroo Onoda's life. He arrived on Lubang Island in December of 1944. The island was under Japanese control at that point, but barely. The Allied advance across the Pacific had been relentless through 1943 and 1944, and the Japanese position in the Philippines was becoming increasingly untenable. The great naval battles that had once made Japanese sea power seem invincible had gone badly. American air superiority was beginning to make supply lines difficult. On Lubang itself, the Japanese garrison was small and its command structure was not entirely coherent. Onoda arrived with orders from his superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had transferred him to Lubang specifically. The orders were clear in their general outline: conduct guerrilla operations, disrupt enemy use of the island's airstrip and pier, and do not surrender. Those words were not instructions for the next few months. They were, though no one could have known it then, instructions for the next 3 decades. When Onoda landed on Lubang, the island's existing Japanese commander refused to allow him to carry out certain operations that might have been strategically useful, including the destruction of the island's airstrip. This was a source of frustration for Onoda, who had arrived with energy and training and a clear sense of mission. But the friction between officers and the confusion of command in those final months of Japanese control over the Philippines meant that many plans went unexecuted. In February of 1945, American forces landed on Lubang Island. The Japanese garrison was overwhelmed quickly. Most of the soldiers were killed or captured in those first days. But a small group, led by Onoda, retreated into the jungle rather than surrender. There were initially 4 of them, Onoda himself, and 3 other soldiers named Private Yuichi Akatsu, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Corporal Shoichi Shimada. They moved into the deep interior of the island. They climbed into the hills, into the densest parts of the forest, where the undergrowth was so thick that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. They found the streams and learned to follow them. They found the places where the canopy parted enough to let in light. They found shelter in caves and overhangs and the hollows of old trees. And they waited. They waited for the orders that would tell them the war was progressing as it should, that Japan was fighting back, that reinforcements were coming. They waited in the green and breathing dark of the Lubang jungle, for young men who had been trained to endure anything, listening to the forest around them, believing with absolute certainty that the world beyond the trees was still the world they had been told about. Part 2, The War Ends, but not for everyone. The war was over. In cities across Japan, people stopped in the streets. Some wept. Some stood in a silence so complete it was like a held breath. Some felt relief, though that relief was complicated and private, because to feel it openly seemed somehow like a betrayal of everyone who had sacrificed. Some felt genuine shock, because the propaganda of the final years had been so insistent about the possibility of victory that the surrender arrived like a rupture in reality. The news spread. It moved through Asia, through the Pacific, through the far-flung corners of what had been the Japanese Empire. In the Philippines, where the fighting had been particularly brutal and protracted, the relief was enormous. Filipino civilians who had lived under Japanese occupation for years began cautiously to imagine what ordinary life might look like again. But on a particular hillside on Lubang Island, the news did not arrive. Or rather, it arrived, but in a form that Hiroo Onoda and his companions were trained to distrust. The jungle has its own information economy. Things drift in, fragments of sound, torn pieces of paper carried on wind or left by careless hands, the distant thrum of aircraft engines, the sight of unfamiliar military movements far below in the valleys. In the months after August 1945, Onoda's group began to encounter things that might have told them the war had ended. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft over the island, printed in Japanese, informing Japanese soldiers that the emperor had surrendered and that they should lay down their arms and come out of the jungle. The leaflets settled in the undergrowth like giant pale leaves, rustling among the ferns. Onoda read them. He read them carefully, with the analytical mind of an Nakano-trained intelligence operative. And he concluded, with a certainty that must have been almost comforting in its completeness, that they were propaganda. He had been trained to expect exactly this kind of thing. The Nakano curriculum had addressed psychological operations specifically. The enemy, he had been taught, would use fake documents, fake broadcasts, fake announcements to demoralize Japanese soldiers and convince them to lay down their arms. This was exactly what those leaflets appeared to be. The reasoning was not irrational given his training. In fact, from within the framework of what he had been taught, it was precisely the correct response. A soldier who surrenders based on enemy propaganda, without orders from his own commanding officer, has been defeated not by force but by deception. The Nakano school had prepared Onoda specifically not to be defeated in that way. And so the leaflets were discarded. And the 4 men in the jungle continued their mission. The months that followed became a kind of suspended reality. They moved carefully through the hills, avoiding contact with civilians, avoiding detection by what they believed were enemy patrols. They foraged for food, supplementing what they could gather with the occasional raid on farms at the edge of the forest, taking small amounts of food, sometimes cattle, which they needed for sustenance. They were careful and methodical and quiet. And all around them, without their knowledge, the world was transforming. The Philippines gained independence in 1946. A new constitution was written. A new government formed. The Japanese occupation, which had been brutal in many parts of the archipelago, was over, and the slow work of reconstruction and national self-definition began. Children who had been born during the occupation grew up in a country that was learning to be itself again. Markets reopened. Schools were rebuilt. The rhythms of ordinary life, interrupted by years of violence and uncertainty, began to return. None of this penetrated the canopy of the Lubang jungle in any way that Onoda could accept as real. There is something quietly heartbreaking about this when you sit with it slowly. The world around a person can change completely, every political structure, every social assumption, every material fact, and yet the interior world, the world of belief and training and mission, can remain absolutely fixed. The jungle stayed the same. The hills stayed the same. The rain came in the same seasons. The birds called in the same patterns. From inside the forest, there was no visible reason to believe that anything fundamental had changed. In 1946, newspapers from the outside world began to reach the island. Some of these were left in places where Japanese soldiers might find them, deliberately, by Filipino and American officials who were trying to communicate the fact of the surrender. Onoda found some of these. He read them. And he interpreted their announcements of Japanese surrender as precisely the kind of sophisticated enemy propaganda that he had been trained to identify and resist. The very sophistication of the deception, as he saw it, was proof of how seriously the enemy was trying to break Japanese resolve. He was, in his own mind, being strong. He was, in his own mind, doing exactly what a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army was supposed to do. Outside the jungle, Japan was rebuilding. Under American occupation, which began in September 1945 and would continue until 1952, Japan was undergoing one of the most remarkable national transformations in modern history. A new constitution was written, one that renounced war as a sovereign right and established democratic governance. The economy, shattered by the war, began a slow recovery that would eventually become one of the great economic stories of the 20th century. The emperor, who had been a divine figure around whom the entire ideology of the war had been constructed, remained on the throne but issued a formal statement in January of 1946 renouncing his divine status. He was, he said, a human being. That statement alone, if Onoda had somehow received it and believed it, might have been enough to begin unlocking the cage of his certainty. But it did not reach him. And even if it had, it is not clear that he would have trusted it. He was a man who had been trained, very thoroughly, not to trust information that came from outside his chain of command. Part 3, 4 become 3 become 2. There is a quiet mathematics to survival under extreme isolation. Each person in a small group carries not only their own weight but a portion of everyone else's. The group is a kind of ecosystem, and when it loses a member, something shifts in all the others, something that cannot always be named but is always felt. For the first several years after the war's end, Onoda's group of 4 maintained a difficult but functional cohesion. They had divided their responsibilities. They had established routines. They had created, in the deep interior of Lubang Island, something that resembled, in its small and careful way, a life. They had a camp, or rather a series of camps, because they moved regularly to avoid detection. Each camp was chosen for its defensibility and its access to water. They had learned which plants on the island were edible, which streams ran clean, where the wild bananas grew and when the coconut palms would yield their fruit. They had maintained their weapons with the meticulous care that their training demanded, cleaning and oiling their rifles even in the humidity that makes such work constant on a tropical island. They kept their ammunition dry as best they could, rationing it carefully, aware that resupply was not coming. They also carried something less tangible but equally important. They carried the ideology that had sent them there. They told each other, in the long evenings in the jungle, that Japan was fighting back. That the apparent defeats were tactical retreats. That the propaganda they encountered was evidence of enemy desperation. They reinforced each other's certainty, the way members of any isolated community reinforce the beliefs that hold them together, because the alternative, the possibility that their certainty was misplaced, was simply too large to accommodate. In September of 1949, Private Yuichi Akatsu quietly separated from the group. We do not know exactly what was in his mind in those final weeks before he left. We can imagine very slowly, without dramatizing it, a man who has begun to crack around the edges of his certainty. Perhaps it was something he had read. Perhaps it was something he had seen. Perhaps it was simply the weight of 4 years in the jungle, the accumulated exhaustion of believing something that the physical world around him seemed to contradict. Whatever the reason, Akatsu left. He survived in the jungle alone for 6 months before surrendering to Filipino forces in April of 1950. When news of Akatsu's surrender reached the outside world, there was renewed hope that the remaining soldiers could be persuaded to come out. Efforts were made. Leaflets were dropped again. Messages were sent into the jungle, some of them written by Akatsu himself, urging his former companions to surrender. None of these efforts succeeded. From Onoda's perspective, Akatsu had either been captured or had been broken by enemy propaganda. Either way, his surrender was not information to trust. And then there were 3. The 3 remaining men, Onoda, Kozuka, and Shimada, continued their operations on the island through the early 1950s. They conducted raids on local farms. They fired on Filipino soldiers and police officers who they believed were enemy combatants. They maintained the posture of active guerrilla fighters, because that was what they understood themselves to be. From the perspective of the Filipino authorities and the people who lived on Lubang Island, these 3 men were a genuine and ongoing threat. They were armed. They were skilled in fieldcraft. And they were utterly committed to what they were doing, which made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways that a less committed enemy would not have been. There were periodic searches of the jungle interior by Filipino military forces. Some of these came close enough that the 3 men had to move quickly and quietly through terrain they knew much better than their pursuers. The jungle was their ally in these moments. They knew where the trails led. They knew which streams could be followed without leaving obvious tracks. They knew where the canopy was densest, or a man could lie still for hours and be invisible even to someone passing within a few feet. May 1954. A confrontation in the jungle. Details are sparse, as they often are with events that occur in remote terrain and are witnessed only by the participants. What we know is that Corporal Shoichi Shimada was killed in a skirmish with a Filipino patrol. He was shot. He died in the jungle on the island where he had spent nearly a decade since the war's end. Shimada had been a real presence in that small group. He had been one of the men who had helped sustain the belief structure that kept them in the jungle. His loss was significant not only practically but psychologically. Onoda and Kozuka were now 2 men against an island full of people who believed the war had ended 9 years ago. There was a ceremony in Japan after Shimada's death, though of course Onoda did not know this. The Japanese government had already held memorial services for many soldiers who had died in the Pacific, and the names of those confirmed killed or missing had been slowly making their way through the bureaucracies of grief that always follow major wars. Japan, in the years after 1945, was carrying an enormous burden of loss. Millions had died. Hundreds of thousands were missing. Families waited for news that often did not come, or came in forms too painful to accommodate easily. Meanwhile, Onoda and Kozuka moved deeper into their routine. 2 is a different kind of isolation than 4. 2 men in a jungle, with no one else they trust, with no information they can believe, with only each other as witnesses to the truth of what they are doing. 2 men is a very small foundation on which to rest an entire worldview. And yet it held. For almost 2 decades, it held. What does daily life look like for 2 men living in tropical jungle for years at a time? Let yourself imagine it slowly. The morning begins before full light, when the forest is still cool and the birds are just starting their first calls. There is a routine to mornings, checking the perimeter of the camp, verifying that nothing has disturbed the subtle markers they leave to detect the approach of others, preparing whatever food they have. Bananas, perhaps. Coconut. The occasional piece of dried or cooked beef, though cattle raids become riskier as local farmers become more alert to the threat. The water must always be fresh, gathered from running streams, because standing water in the tropics carries risks that can kill a person far more surely than any enemy soldier. Afternoons in the jungle are heavy with heat and humidity. The air between the trees is thick and warm, almost physical in its density. Movement is limited during the hottest hours. The men would have rested, perhaps, in the shade of the deepest forest, listening to the sounds around them, alert to anything unusual. Evenings bring some relief from the heat, and with the relief, a kind of expansiveness, the time when, perhaps, the 2 men talked. What they talked about, we can only imagine. The war. Japan. Their families. The things they remembered from before. They wrote things down. Onoda kept a diary, or something like one notes and observations and the record of events. He maintained detailed records of what they observed, what they did, what they encountered. This was, again, the training of the Nakano school. An intelligence operative maintains records, because information has value even when its immediate use is not apparent. And the years went by. Part 4. The island remembers them. Lubang Island, from the perspective of its civilian population, lived under a shadow during these years. The shadow had a specific shape, 2 armed men in the jungle, unpredictable, operating according to a logic that no one outside their own minds could follow with certainty. The farmers of Lubang were not abstractions. They were real people with real lives, families with children, fields to tend, boats to repair, the ordinary fabric of agricultural existence in the central Philippines. They grew rice and vegetables. They kept livestock, the cattle and carabao that were essential to farm work. They had markets and community events, and the rhythms of Catholic observance that shaped life in the Philippine countryside. They had, in other words, everything that a community needs to sustain itself, except the ability to feel entirely safe in their own fields. Because the jungle was right there. The edge of the cleared farmland gave way very quickly to the dense undergrowth that ran up into the hills. And somewhere in those hills, there were men with guns. Men who had fired on people. Men who had taken cattle. Men who, from the evidence of their actions, did not accept that the rules of peacetime applied to them. The local residents lived with this awareness the way people sometimes live with a persistent low-grade anxiety, present always in the background, never quite forgotten, never fully accommodated. The Philippine military conducted periodic operations to find and capture or kill the remaining holdouts. These operations were complicated by the terrain, which was genuinely difficult for units unfamiliar with it, and by the considerable skill of Onoda and Kozuka at avoiding detection. The jungle interior of Lubang Island was not large by the standards of major military operations, but it was dense enough and complex enough to shelter two careful, trained men almost indefinitely. There were also continuing attempts to communicate with the holdouts peacefully. The Japanese government and Japanese private citizens made various efforts over the years to reach Onoda and Kozuka and convince them that the war was over. These efforts were sincere and sometimes elaborate. Messages were left in the jungle, attached to trees, placed in locations where the holdouts were known to pass. The messages were written in Japanese, in careful and respectful language, and they said, in various ways, that the war had ended, that Japan was at peace, that the emperor wanted his surviving soldiers to come home. This is one of the most profound and, when you sit with it quietly, one of the most human things about Onoda's story. He was not a foolish man. He was not unintelligent. He was, in fact, a highly trained intelligence operative with exceptional survival skills and a formidable capacity for logical analysis within his own framework. The problem was not the absence of intelligence but the nature of the framework through which all incoming information was filtered. Once the framework was established, once the world was divided into trustworthy information, orders from the chain of command, and untrustworthy information, everything else, it became very nearly impermeable. We all have frameworks, of course. We all have the structures of belief and expectation and identity through which we interpret what the world sends us. Most of us, most of the time, have enough contact with enough different people and enough different perspectives that our frameworks are regularly tested, bent, sometimes broken and rebuilt. Onoda's framework had been sealed inside a jungle for years, with only one other person as a source of social reality. Under those conditions, the framework not only persisted but hardened. The local population of Lubang grew up with the story of the soldiers in the jungle. It became part of the island's identity, woven into the stories that older residents told younger ones. Some of those stories were probably frightening, because the holdouts were genuinely dangerous. But some, over time, took on a different quality, something stranger and more complicated, the way that any persistent mystery eventually takes on the texture of legend. There were men in the hills who refused to believe the war was over. Men who had been there since before living memory, who moved through the forest like ghosts, who appeared and disappeared without warning. It was strange and unsettling and, in its way, remarkable. In Japan, the story was also developing a complicated resonance. As the 1950s became the 1960s, and as Japan's post-war transformation accelerated into the extraordinary economic growth that characterized those decades, the idea of a soldier still fighting the old war in some remote jungle began to feel simultaneously admirable and tragic. Admirable because it spoke to a quality of loyalty and dedication that Japanese culture had long held dear. Tragic because it seemed to represent something frozen in time, something that belonged to a world that no longer existed, a kind of loyalty so complete it had become its own prison. In 1959, the Japanese government officially declared Hiroo Onoda dead. This was not an unusual step. Many soldiers missing in the Pacific had been declared dead in the years after the war, when it became clear that no further word would come. But for Onoda's family in Wakayama Prefecture, the declaration had a particular weight. His parents, his siblings, the people who had known him before the war, they received the legal and social confirmation that he was gone. Memorial services were held. His name joined the long lists of those who had been lost. And deep in the Lubang jungle, Hiroo Onoda continued to live. Part 5: The Weight of Decades. There is a particular quality to time when it passes without markers. Most of us move through our years held up by events, birthdays, anniversaries, elections, the deaths of people we love, the births of others, the first cold morning of autumn that tells us the year is turning. These events are not just personal, they connect us to the shared time of the communities we belong to. They tell us where we are. Onoda and Kozuka had very few of these markers. They had the seasons, which in the Philippines are less dramatically distinct than in temperate climates but are present nonetheless, the wet season, when the rain comes in heavy afternoon downpours that turn the streams into rushing brown water, the dry season, when the forest floor becomes crackly with fallen leaves and the streams run low. They had the cycle of the moon, which matters enormously to people who live without artificial light and must navigate by what the sky provides. They had their own physical changes, the slow alterations of bodies aging without mirrors to reflect the fact, without others to observe and name it. The 1960s passed. In Japan, those years were defined by the economic miracle, the extraordinary rate of growth that was turning Japan into a modern industrial power, rebuilding cities that had been destroyed, creating a consumer culture that would eventually come to define much of what the world thought of when it thought about Japan. In the Philippines, the 1960s brought the presidency of Ferdinand Marcos, the beginning of a political era that would eventually end in martial law and dictatorship. In America, those years brought assassinations and a movement for civil rights and a war in Vietnam that seemed to echo, in strange ways, some of the same dynamics that had played out in the Pacific 20 years before. The world was in motion, rapid and transforming and loud with change. On Lubang Island, two men moved through the jungle with the same careful rhythm they had been maintaining for years. October 1972. Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka was killed. The circumstances involve a confrontation with Filipino soldiers during what appears to have been a raid. He was 51 years old, and he had been living in the jungle of Lubang Island for 27 years. He died far from everything he had known before the war, far from the Japan that had sent him to fight and that had, by this point, transformed itself into something he would not have recognized. Onoda was now alone. The last of his companions was gone. He was 50 years old, and he had been in the jungle since 1944. He had outlasted 3 companions. He had outlasted, by all conventional logic, the mission itself. He was a single man on an island where everyone except himself understood that the war had ended 3 decades ago. What does a person do with solitude that is that complete? The human need for social contact is profound and not easily satisfied by substitutes. Some people who experience extreme isolation report speaking to themselves, to imaginary companions, to the natural world around them. Some report a kind of expanded awareness of their physical environment, as if the senses, deprived of their usual social input, turn outward and find richness in things that a person with normal social contact might not notice. The texture of bark. The specific calls of individual birds. The way rain falls differently in different parts of the forest. The natural world becomes, in some ways, company. Onoda had always been deeply attentive to his environment. The Nakano training had sharpened skills of observation that were probably innate, and decades of survival in the jungle had refined them further. He knew Lubang Island in a way that perhaps no other living person did. He knew its streams and its hills, its hidden clearings, its seasonal changes. He knew where certain plants grew and when they fruited. He knew the movements of animals, the patterns of weather, the sounds that belonged to the forest and the sounds that did not. This knowledge was survival. But it may also have been something more, a form of connection, a way of being part of something, even in the absence of human community. After Kozuka's death, the Japanese government and various private organizations intensified their efforts to find Onoda. Search parties were organized. Messages were broadcast over loudspeakers into the jungle, in Japanese, asking Onoda to come out. Former colleagues and military acquaintances recorded messages that were played into the forest. A reward was offered for information leading to Onoda's location. None of it succeeded immediately. Onoda was 50 years old, alone, and completely committed to his mission. He moved constantly, covering his tracks, avoiding the areas where searchers were active. He had learned, over 30 years, how to be invisible in the Lubang jungle. No one had to teach him that skill now, it was simply part of how he moved through the world. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that is indistinguishable, from the outside, from strength of character. Or perhaps it is not stubbornness at all. Perhaps it is something more fundamental, the deep human need to make the sacrifice of years mean something. If Onoda had come out of the jungle and learned that the war had ended in 1945, he would have had to accommodate the fact that the people who died alongside him, Shimada, Kozuka, died not in a war that was still being fought, but for nothing. He would have had to accommodate 3 decades of decisions made on the basis of a mistaken belief. That is a very heavy thing to carry. And perhaps, somewhere in the depths of the human psychology that no training can fully reach, the jungle was safer than that knowledge. Part 6: The Young Man from Tokyo. In 1974, a young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki set out to travel the world. He was 23 years old, adventurous in the particular way of young people who have not yet been told often enough that certain things are impossible. He had a rucksack and a camera and a list of things he wanted to find. The list, by his own account, included a few specific quarries: Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a panda bear, and the abominable snowman. He ranked them, apparently, in that order of likelihood. There is something endearing about this. Here was a young man who went looking for a 30-year legend the way other people might go looking for a good restaurant in an unfamiliar city, with curiosity and optimism and no particular reason to believe the search would fail. While governments and military organizations and trained search parties had spent years failing to find Onoda, Norio Suzuki simply decided to go to Lubang Island and look. He arrived on the island and began asking questions. He talked to local residents, to farmers, to anyone who might have information about the elusive holdout. He spent time in the areas where Onoda was believed to operate. He left signs, not official leaflets but something more personal, more human, indications that he was there, that he was looking, that he meant no harm. And remarkably, after a few days, Onoda appeared. Or rather, Onoda made contact, cautiously, maintaining the edge of the forest between himself and this unexpected visitor. Suzuki, to his considerable credit, did not panic and did not immediately try to turn the encounter into a capture or a confrontation. He spoke to Onoda calmly and respectfully, treating him as a soldier, as someone deserving of dignity. The conversation that followed was extraordinary in its way. Here were 2 Japanese men, separated by nearly 30 years in age, sitting at the edge of a Philippine jungle, talking about a war that one of them had fought as a child and the other had been fighting all his adult life. Suzuki told Onoda that the war was over. Onoda, trained to distrust exactly this kind of message, told Suzuki something that was at once entirely logical and entirely heartbreaking: he could not lay down his arms without orders from his commanding officer. That was his position. That was what he had been trained to say. That was, in a fundamental sense, all he had left. Suzuki was not able to provide that. But he was able to do something that no government search party had managed. He was able to establish a human connection. He was able to sit with Onoda and photograph him and talk with him, and he left Lubang Island with something that nobody had brought back from it in 30 years, proof that Hiroo Onoda was alive. The photographs Suzuki brought back to Japan caused an enormous sensation. Here was a man the country had believed dead for 15 years. Here was a face older than anyone had seen it, weathered by 30 years of jungle survival, framed by hair that no barber had touched in decades, but unmistakably the face of a man. A man who was alive. A man who was still in the jungle. A man who was still waiting for orders. The Japanese government moved quickly after Suzuki's return. They located the one person who could, under the terms of Onoda's own understanding of his duty, relieve him of his mission. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Major Taniguchi was still alive. He was in his late 60s now, living a quiet civilian life in Japan, working as a bookseller. The war had ended for him in 1945, as it had for almost everyone. He had moved through the decades of post-war Japan, watching the country rebuild and transform, living the life of an ordinary citizen in a country that was rapidly becoming one of the most prosperous in the world. And then, in early 1974, he received the news that the soldier he had left on Lubang Island was still there, still fighting, still waiting for his orders. We have no detailed record of what Taniguchi felt upon receiving this news. But it is possible to imagine, slowly and carefully, the weight of that moment. A man who had given orders 30 years ago, orders that he had never rescinded because he had not thought it necessary or perhaps had not been able to, was now being asked to travel to a Philippine jungle to give a soldier permission to stop fighting. To tell a man that the world he had been defending no longer existed. Taniguchi agreed. He traveled to the Philippines. He traveled to Lubang Island. And on the 9th of March, 1974, he walked into the jungle to find Hiroo Onoda. Part 7, The Order to Stand Down. The 9th of March, 1974. Consider for a moment what that date contains. Nearly 30 years since the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. 29 years since American forces had landed on Lubang Island. 29 years of jungle. Of rain and heat. Of solitude and silence and the absolute commitment to a mission that the rest of the world had closed the book on before most of the people who would later read about Onoda were born. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi walked into the jungle on Lubang Island carrying the weight of all of that. He was escorted by Filipino officials and military personnel who understood the significance of what was happening. Norio Suzuki was also there, because it was Suzuki who had established the initial contact and Suzuki who had communicated with Onoda about the possibility of Taniguchi's arrival. The meeting had been arranged as carefully as any official ceremony, though it was taking place in the undergrowth of a tropical forest rather than in a formal chamber. When Taniguchi appeared, Onoda was waiting for him. He was dressed in his military uniform, the one he had maintained through 30 years of jungle survival, patched and repaired many times over, but recognizably a uniform, recognizably the garb of a soldier who had never stopped being one. His rifle was clean and functional. His ammunition pouches were properly arranged. He was, in every external detail he could manage, the soldier who had arrived on this island in 1944. Taniguchi was in civilian clothes. That fact itself carries something. The officer who had given Onoda his original orders was standing before him not as a military man but as a private citizen, a bookseller in his late 60s, a man who had spent the post-war decades in a Japan that his former subordinate had never seen. Taniguchi read the orders officially. The language was formal and military, as Onoda would have expected and required. The orders stated that all combat activity was to cease immediately. That Onoda was hereby relieved of his duties. That he was to lay down his arms and surrender to the Philippine government. The orders came, as Onoda had always insisted they must, from his commanding officer. They were exactly what he had said he needed in order to stop fighting. Onoda heard the orders read. And then, and this is the moment that accounts of this event always slow down around, the moment that seems to require more space than ordinary language can provide, he complied. He removed his rifle from his shoulder. He laid it on the ground. He placed beside it his bayonet, his ammunition, and the hand grenades he still carried. He had 500 rounds of ammunition remaining. He had the bayonet. He had the grenades. He had maintained them all, through 3 decades of tropical humidity and isolation, in working order. What Onoda said afterward, in various interviews and in the memoir he eventually wrote, is worth sitting with slowly. He did not describe that moment as a relief. He did not describe it as the end of a long nightmare from which he had finally awoken. He described it with something closer to grief. Because when Taniguchi read the orders, everything that Onoda had believed and sustained and built his life around for 30 years collapsed into its true shape. The war had been over since 1945. The men who had died alongside him, Shimada in 1954, Kozuka in 1972, had died after the war ended. The raids on local farms, the skirmishes with Filipino soldiers, all of the violence of 30 years of guerrilla operations, all of it had occurred in a world that had already made peace. He said, later, that he cried. Not out of joy at being released, but out of sorrow for his dead comrades, for the soldiers who had not made it to this moment, who had died fighting a war that was already over. He described feeling that he had failed them, which is perhaps the most painful of the many painful things that could be said about this moment. He had stayed, out of loyalty. He had stayed because loyalty was the highest value his training had given him. And in staying, he had outlived them all, and stood in the jungle sunlight with nothing left to be loyal to. The formal surrender took place with Filipino officials present. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, in a gesture that was both politically savvy and genuinely human, immediately pardoned Onoda for his actions on the island during the post-war decades. The pardon was significant. Onoda had been responsible for the deaths of Filipino soldiers and civilians during his 3 decades of operations. Estimates suggest that 30 people had been killed and around 100 wounded as a result of the holdouts' activities on Lubang Island. These were real losses for real families, and acknowledging them matters. Marcos's pardon did not erase those losses, but it framed Onoda's actions within an understanding of his psychological situation, that he had been acting in good faith, according to the only framework for reality that he had access to. President Marcos also received Onoda in an official ceremony and returned his sword to him, a gesture with deep resonance in Japanese martial culture. The return of the sword acknowledged Onoda as a warrior, as someone whose conduct, whatever its costs, had proceeded from a genuine and deeply held sense of honor. Onoda was 52 years old. He had been in the jungle since he was 22. Part 8. returning to a country he had never known. Hiroo Onoda flew to Japan in March of 1974. He stepped off the plane into a country that was his by birth, by language, by the deepest layers of cultural formation, and that was, in nearly every other way, entirely alien to him. The Japan of 1974 was a prosperous, modern, industrial democracy. Its cities were full of neon and traffic and the particular noise of consumer culture in full flourishing. The people wore different clothes and spoke with inflections that had changed over 30 years. The food had changed. The music had changed. The technology, television, automobiles in numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1944, the beginnings of what would eventually become Japan's electronics revolution, was completely foreign to him. And yet, in the most important ways, Onoda was immediately and entirely Japanese. The language was his. The face in every mirror was a face that could have belonged to countless men his age walking the streets of any Japanese city. The values he carried, loyalty, discipline, endurance, the primacy of duty, were values that Japanese culture recognized and honored, even if the specific form those values had taken in his case was unusual to the point of being singular. He was received as a hero. That reception was complicated and not without its critics, and we will come to those complications slowly. But in the immediate moment of his return, the dominant public response in Japan was one of profound and complex emotion. Here was a man who had endured 30 years of hardship out of loyalty to his country and his commanding officer. That kind of loyalty was something that the Japanese cultural tradition had stories for, had ceremonies for, had a language for. The comparison to the great loyal samurai of feudal Japan was made almost immediately, and it was made with genuine feeling. His family received him. His parents had died while he was in the jungle. The parents who had raised him in Wakayama, who had watched him go off to war, who had eventually received the official notification that he was dead, they were not there to see him come home. His siblings were. The reunion with his surviving family, like all such reunions after extreme absences, must have been full of the particular strangeness that comes from meeting people you love who have become, in important ways, people you do not know. They had aged. They had lived their lives. They had marriages and children and careers and the accumulated history of decades that Onoda had not shared. He had aged too, in a different way, in a different place, carrying a different story. He wrote a memoir, published in Japanese and later translated into several languages, called No Surrender, My 30-Year War. The title was precise. That is exactly what it had been. The book detailed his experiences with a level of operational and psychological specificity that made it valuable as a document not only of his personal experience but of the Nakano School's methods and of the psychology of extreme commitment and isolation. But not all of the reception was uncritical. In the Philippines, the reaction was more complicated. For the families of the people who had been killed and wounded during Onoda's 3 decades of operations on Lubang Island, his return to Japan and his reception as a hero was painful. Their loved ones were equally dead, whether Onoda had believed the war was still ongoing or not. Their grief was real. Their loss was real. The narrative of Onoda as loyal soldier, as last samurai, as noble anachronism, that narrative, from the perspective of people who had lived under the shadow of his operations for 30 years, could feel like it was being written over their experience. This is a tension worth sitting with quietly, not to resolve it but to acknowledge it. Human stories rarely have the clean lines of legend. Onoda's story contains genuine tragedy, genuine nobility, and genuine harm, and all three of those things are true simultaneously. He was a man of extraordinary endurance and commitment. He was a man who had been shaped by forces that he did not choose and could not, once fully formed, easily escape. He was also a man whose actions, however understandable in their logic, had real costs for real people who had done nothing to deserve them. Both of these things are part of the story. These were serious arguments, and Onoda himself seemed, in some ways, to feel their weight. He did not present himself, in his memoir or in his public statements, as a simple hero. He was honest about the violence of his years in the jungle. He was honest about his grief for his dead comrades. He was, in his way, a man trying to understand the thing that had happened to him and to do justice to its full complexity. Part 9: Brazil and the Return to the Wild. Japan in the mid-1970s was too much for Hiroo Onoda. That, at least, is the impression one gets from what he did next. In 1975, a year after his return, he emigrated to Brazil. He settled in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, in the interior of the country, in an area of open land where he established a cattle ranch. He had married a woman named Machi Onoda, who had been supporting his cause since before his return, who had written letters and advocated for his recognition. They built a life together on the ranch, far from the cities, in wide open country under a large South American sky. The choice to go to Brazil is worth pausing over. There was a significant Japanese-Brazilian community in Brazil, the largest outside Japan, dating back to the early 20th century when Japanese emigration to South America had been substantial. Brazil offered something that Japan, with its density and its noise and its relentless modernity, did not: space. Open land, physical work, the outdoors, the kind of life that required attention and skill but was not overwhelmed by technology and crowds. Onoda, who had spent 30 years in the jungle, who had learned to read the natural world with extraordinary precision, who had organized his existence around the rhythms of the outdoor environment, Onoda was, perhaps, constitutionally better suited to a ranch in rural Brazil than to a Tokyo apartment. He had been stripped, by 30 years of jungle life, of much of the capacity for the kind of existence that a modern urban environment demands. The noise, the speed, the constant social interaction, the complexity of navigating a world where everything had changed, it was, apparently, genuinely difficult. On the ranch, he worked with cattle. He learned Portuguese. He made friends among the Japanese-Brazilian community. He and his wife built something that, for the first time in his adult life, resembled an ordinary domestic existence. There was a house. There were meals. There was the quiet of evenings on a large property, with the sounds of animals and the wide sky in the distance to the nearest city that provided a kind of breathing room. There was, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, a life. But he maintained connections with Japan. He returned periodically. He gave lectures. He remained a public figure, sought out for his perspective on themes of loyalty, endurance, education, and the relationship between discipline and character. He had thoughts about all of these things, and they were thoughts shaped by an experience that no one else alive had had. In 1984, Onoda returned to Japan permanently. He had spent nearly a decade in Brazil, and the experience had given him something important, a kind of distance from the immediate aftermath of his return, a period in which he could begin to integrate what had happened to him without the constant pressure of public attention. He came back to Japan with a project in mind. He established an organization called the Onoda Nature School, later renamed Onoda Shurzenjuku, which was dedicated to outdoor education for young people. The school was his answer to a concern that had been growing in him as he observed Japanese society, that young people were losing their connection to the natural world, losing the capacity for physical endurance and self-reliance, being shaped entirely by the indoor, digital, comfort-oriented environment of modern urban life. He believed, from everything his life had taught him, that the capacity to survive in difficult circumstances, the capacity to be cold and wet and tired and still think clearly, still make good decisions, still function, was not a specialty skill but a fundamental human competence that needed to be cultivated. If it was not cultivated, he thought, it would atrophy. And a person or a society that had lost it was more fragile than they knew. This is perhaps the most unexpected turn of the Onoda story, that a man who had spent 30 years in the jungle became an educator dedicated to sending other people into the wild. But there is a coherence to it that, when you follow it slowly, becomes clear. The jungle had been, for all its hardship and its strange isolation and its tragedy, the place where Onoda had learned the most important things he knew. It had taught him patience, and endurance, and attention, and the ability to think clearly in the absence of comfort. Those were gifts, of a kind. Painful gifts, wrapped in circumstances that no one would wish on anyone. But gifts nonetheless. He spent his later years running the school, traveling, speaking, and writing. He became a figure of considerable moral complexity in the Japanese cultural imagination, neither simply a hero nor simply a victim, but something harder to categorize, which is usually closer to the truth of actual human lives. Part 10: What the Jungle Made Him. There is a question that follows this story wherever it goes, a question that is never quite answered and perhaps cannot be. What does it do to a person, to live for 30 years in the unbroken certainty of a belief that turns out to be wrong? Onoda himself addressed this question in various ways throughout his later life. He was not a man who indulged in prolonged public expressions of regret or self-reproach, which was itself a product of the same formation that had produced everything else about him. But he was honest, in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes direct, about the complexity of what he had experienced. He spoke about the moment he heard Taniguchi read the orders, and about the collapse of his worldview in that moment. He said that he had felt, in that moment, something like the dissolution of everything he had been. The mission that had been the structure of his existence for 30 years was gone. The war that had given his isolation meaning was revealed to have been over for 29 of those 30 years. The comrades who had died beside him had died, in the most literal sense, for nothing, or rather, for a mistake, which is in some ways worse than nothing. He grieved for Shimada and Kozuka. He said so explicitly, and the grief is evident in the way he discussed them throughout his later life. These were men who had trusted him, who had followed his reading of the situation, who had died before they could learn that they might have gone home. There is a form of guilt in that which has no clean resolution. Onoda had not deceived his comrades. He had been deceived, in a sense, by his own training, by the framework of interpretation that had been installed in him at the Nakano school and that had proven, in this specific and catastrophic instance, impermeable to corrective information. He had done what he genuinely believed was right. He had done what his training told him a soldier must do. He had, by his own lights, never failed in his duty. And yet, the question of the people on Lubang Island, the 30 who died, the 100 who were wounded, was one that Onoda was asked about throughout his later life. He expressed sorrow for them. He expressed regret. He did not attempt to minimize the harm his operations had caused. But he was also consistent in saying that he had believed, at the time, that he was fighting an enemy in a war that was still ongoing. He had not understood them as innocent civilians living in peacetime. He had understood them as people in a war zone. In 1996, Onoda returned to the Philippines. He returned to Lubang Island. He donated money to a local school, a sum equivalent to $10,000, which was the amount he had received from the sale of his cattle after he came out of the jungle. He donated it as a gesture of acknowledgement and goodwill toward the community that had lived under the shadow of his operations for 3 decades. The gesture was received with a range of emotions, acceptance by some, complicated feelings by others, which is probably the only honest range of responses to an offer that can neither undo what happened nor adequately represent what was lost. He walked through the island. He visited the places he had known. The jungle was still there, though some of the areas he had operated in had changed, cleared for farming, or simply altered by the natural succession of vegetation over decades. He was 64 years old, and he was walking through the landscape of the most significant portion of his life, seeing it now through the eyes of a person who knew what it had actually been, not a battlefield in an ongoing war, but an island that had been trying to be at peace. The visit was quiet and did not resolve anything, because some things do not resolve. They simply become part of the layered history of a place, the way all human stories eventually become part of the geography they occur in. Onoda's story intersects, in interesting ways, with broader historical and philosophical questions. It is a story about the relationship between belief and evidence, about what it takes to change a fundamental conviction when all information arrives through a framework that filters out the evidence that might challenge it. It is a story about loyalty and its limits, about the difference between loyalty that serves genuine values and loyalty that has become untethered from the purpose it was meant to serve. It is a story about time, and what happens to a human being when time continues to pass in the world while standing still in the mind. And it is a story about the cost of war, not only the immediate cost, measured in deaths on battlefields, but the long cost, the cost that continues to accumulate for years and decades after the formal ending, in the lives of people who were marked by it and never fully unmade. Japan has its tradition of the Ronin, the samurai without a master, the warrior who has outlived the lord to whom his loyalty was given and must find his way in a world that no longer has a clear place for him. Onoda was, in a very specific sense, a Ronin, a soldier without a war, a warrior whose loyalty had carried him past the point where the object of that loyalty existed. The samurai tradition has complex things to say about that condition, and Japan recognized something of those complexities in Onoda's story. He was not simply a curiosity or an anachronism. He was, for many, a figure who raised genuinely difficult questions about what it means to be faithful to a commitment when the commitment itself has changed shape around you. He returned to Japan after the 1996 visit and continued his work with the Nature School. He continued to speak and to write. He remained a thoughtful and articulate presence in discussions of education, character, and the relationship between human beings and the natural world. He was not bitter, at least not in any way he displayed publicly. He was, if anything, deliberate, a man who chose his words with the same care he had once chosen his footsteps in the jungle. Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014. He was 91 years old. He died in Tokyo, in a hospital, of complications from pneumonia. He had outlived almost everyone who had been part of his story, his comrades, his commanding officer, the Filipino officials who had received his surrender, most of the people who had searched for him. He had lived, in the end, a very long life. 30 years of jungle. another 40 of the ordinary complicated world beyond it. He had traveled and written and educated and been interviewed and photographed and argued about and commemorated. He had married and built a home and raised no children of his own but influenced many through his school. He had, in the most essential sense, found a way to live, not easily, and not without the weight of everything that had come before, but genuinely and with purpose. Part 11. The Others, Soldiers Who Kept Fighting. Hiroo Onoda was not the only Japanese soldier who continued fighting after the war's end. His is the most extraordinary case in terms of duration, but he existed in a broader context of soldiers who, for various reasons, did not receive or did not accept the news of the surrender. Understanding that context adds texture to Onoda's story and to what the war's ending actually meant, in practical terms, across the vast distances of the Pacific Theater. The Japanese Empire in 1945 stretched across an enormous arc of Asia and the Pacific. From the home islands to the coast of China, from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, Japanese forces were deployed in conditions that ranged from relatively organized to genuinely chaotic. Communication was difficult even in the best of circumstances, and by mid-1945 the Allied air campaign had made it substantially worse, disrupting supply lines, destroying radio equipment, and creating conditions in which isolated units might genuinely have no reliable way to receive information from Central Command. When the Emperor's announcement came on August 15, 1945, the mechanisms for distributing that information across the full extent of the Japanese military were imperfect at best. Some units received word quickly. Others did not receive it for days or weeks. Some soldiers, particularly those in remote jungle postings or on small islands far from major communication nodes, received the news only when someone physically carried it to them. And some, for reasons that varied from case to case, did not receive it at all, or received it in forms they did not trust. Teruo Nakamura was one such soldier. His story has some parallels with Onoda's and some important differences, and sitting with both of them together reveals something about how different paths can lead to the same kind of profound dislocation from reality. Nakamura was born in 1919 on Formosa, which was then part of the Japanese Empire. It is now Taiwan. He was not ethnically Japanese but Amos, one of the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. He had been conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army's auxiliary forces, the Takasago Volunteers, and had been deployed to the Indonesian island of Morotai. When the war ended, he did not come out of the jungle. He was living alone in the interior of Morotai when he was finally discovered and identified by Indonesian authorities in December of 1974, 9 months after Onoda's surrender. He was repatriated not to Japan but to Taiwan, where his status was complicated by the post-war political transformations that had removed Taiwan from Japanese sovereignty. He died in 1979. Nakamura's case is notable for several reasons. He had lived alone in the jungle for approximately 30 years, similar to Onoda's duration. But unlike Onoda, who was a highly trained intelligence operative with specific orders and a clear ideological framework, Nakamura appears to have survived more through instinct and indigenous bushcraft knowledge than through formal military training. He had built himself a small compound in the jungle, with a garden where he grew food. He had, in a sense, settled in, creating a life in the jungle that was sustainable in its own way even if it was completely cut off from the social world. Earlier still was the case of Hiroo Onoda's contemporary on Guam, a man named Shuichi Yokoi. Yokoi had been a sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army, deployed to Guam, which American forces had retaken in 1944. Rather than surrender or die in battle, he retreated into the jungle interior of the island and lived there, for 28 years, until he was discovered by local hunters in January of 1972. He was 56 years old when he came out of the jungle, and he had spent those 28 years living in a remarkably self-sufficient way. He had dug himself a cave, woven clothing from jungle fibers, and sustained himself on what the jungle provided. Yokoi's famous statement upon his return to Japan, "It is with much embarrassment that I have returned alive," captures something essential about the worldview that these men shared. The embarrassment was not ironic. It was genuine. Within the framework of the Bushido tradition and the military culture that had shaped them, surviving when one's comrades had died, and returning alive rather than dying in battle, carried a real social weight. Death in the service of the emperor was honorable. Survival in circumstances that might suggest anything less than total commitment was something to apologize for. That Yokoi had spent 28 years in a jungle cave was, in the framework of his own values, not evidence of extraordinary endurance but evidence that he had failed to find a way to die properly for his cause. The contrast with how the outside world received his statement, with confusion, with amazement, with sympathy, illustrates how completely the cultural framework that had produced these men had diverged from the post-war world they were returning to. There were dozens of other, less celebrated cases. Individual soldiers and small groups who held out for months or years in various parts of the former Japanese Empire, who were gradually found and either captured or persuaded to surrender in the years after 1945. Some of these surrenders came relatively quickly, within the first year or two after the war. Some took longer. A few, like Onoda's and Nakamura's, extended into the 1970s. What united them was not the duration of their holdouts but the specific quality of their commitment, the sense that surrender was not simply a strategic option to be weighed against alternatives, but a moral impossibility, something that would constitute a fundamental betrayal of everything they had been formed to be. This is worth understanding not as irrational fanaticism but as the product of a specific and coherent ideological formation that, while it produced outcomes the rest of the world found incomprehensible, was internally consistent and, for those who held it, felt like the only honorable path available. The Japanese military tradition had deep roots in the samurai culture of earlier centuries, and one of the central tenets of that culture was the absolute primacy of loyalty. The samurai's identity was not primarily his own, it belonged to his lord, his han, his cause. To abandon that loyalty was not simply a failure of nerve but a kind of annihilation of the self, because the self was constituted, in that framework, by its loyalty. A samurai without a lord was not a free man. He was a ghost, an entity without social existence. The militarist ideology of the 1930s and 1940s had drawn heavily on this tradition, translating the feudal loyalty of samurai to lord into the modern loyalty of soldier to emperor and nation. The emperor was the supreme lord, the nation was the han, and the war was the great cause to which every soldier's identity was pledged. To surrender, in this framework, was not only a military act but a metaphysical one. It was to unmake oneself as a human being of value. Onoda, Yokoi, Nakamura, and the others were shaped by this framework so completely that the ending of the war could not, on its own, release them from it. The framework required the release to come from within itself, from the chain of command, from the lord to whom loyalty was pledged. Without that, information from outside was simply enemy propaganda, and surrender was simply death of the spirit. This is why Norio Suzuki's arrival on Lubang Island was so significant, not because Suzuki himself could release Onoda, but because Suzuki was the first person who found a way through the social distance and established the human connection that made it possible to bring Taniguchi. The framework required a commanding officer. Suzuki brought one. In a very real sense, it took the right kind of messenger before the right kind of message could arrive. The broader phenomenon of Japanese holdouts also raises questions about how wars end, or fail to end, for the people who fought them. The formal ending of a war is a political and legal event, recorded in treaties and ceremonies and official announcements. But the psychological ending of a war is a different thing entirely, and it proceeds at a different pace for different people. For some, the psychological ending comes before the formal one, soldiers who are exhausted and ready for it to be over before any treaty is signed. For others, it takes longer, veterans who return to civilian life but carry the war inside them for years, who find that the person they were before the war no longer fits the life waiting for them. For Onoda and his fellow holdouts, the psychological ending was delayed not just by trauma but by ideology, by a belief system that had been specifically designed to make it impossible. The Nakano school had created, with great skill and thoroughness, a kind of soldier who could not be psychologically defeated by the normal mechanisms of defeat. That was an achievement, within the military logic of the time. But it was also, as Onoda's case demonstrates with particular clarity, a form of damage, a damage inflicted on the very soldiers it was designed to strengthen, a damage that could not be reversed by the simple ending of hostilities. There is something in this worth carrying quietly as you breathe and let the day go. The frameworks we are given in life, the beliefs, the loyalties, the identities that are formed in us by our families and our cultures and our institutions, are often gifts. They give us strength and direction and a sense of who we are. But they are also constraints, and sometimes the constraints outlast their usefulness, and we find ourselves, in one way or another, still fighting battles that the world around us has already resolved. Most of us are not in a jungle. Most of us are not armed. But most of us carry something of the holdout within us, some belief or loyalty or identity that we maintain beyond its natural term, because releasing it would require us to confront something about the years we spent maintaining it. The story of Hiroo Onoda is, among other things, a very extreme and very human version of that universal experience. Part 12, What Remains? Hiroo Onoda is gone now. He died in the winter of 2014, in his 92nd year, in a hospital in Tokyo. The death was reported around the world, because his story had become, over the decades since his surrender, one of those historical episodes that people return to periodically, not because it is simple or comfortable, but because it is not. When a person who has lived an unusual life dies, the people who knew them and the culture that contained them go through a particular process. They try to find the meaning. They try to place the life in a narrative that makes sense of it, that extracts from the particular and strange and painful facts some general truth that can be carried forward. The process does not always succeed. Some lives resist the clean narrative. Some stories end without resolving into a lesson, and the honest thing is to let them remain unresolved and to sit with the discomfort of that. Onoda's story has attracted many different narratives over the years. The narrative of heroism, a man of extraordinary endurance and commitment, a true samurai, loyal beyond all ordinary measure. The narrative of tragedy, a man imprisoned by his own training, sacrificing the best decades of his life to a cause that had ceased to exist before those decades began. The narrative of warning, a case study in the dangers of ideological formation so complete that it cannot accommodate corrective information. The narrative of human resilience, a demonstration of what the human organism and spirit can endure when given sufficient conviction to sustain them. All of these narratives contain truth. None of them contains the whole truth. The whole truth is Hiroo Onoda himself, a specific person, born in a specific place in a specific year, shaped by specific forces, living a life that was shaped by all of that in ways that no narrative can fully capture. What we can say with some certainty is that his life had weight. It mattered, and not only as a curiosity or an extreme example. It mattered because it pressed against questions that are genuinely important, questions that human beings in every era have had to face in one form or another. What is loyalty worth when the thing you are loyal to no longer exists in the form you believed it to have? How do we know what is true when the only sources of information we trust belong to a system that may itself be flawed? How long can a person sustain a belief against accumulating evidence to the contrary, and what does it cost them to do so? And when the belief finally breaks, when the forest opens and the commanding officer is standing there in civilian clothes reading orders that end everything, what is left of the person who held it? These are not questions unique to Japanese military culture or to the Second World War. They are questions about the human condition, about the relationship between conviction and reality, about what it means to be faithful to something and what happens when that something turns out to have been different from what you thought. Every era and every culture has its versions of these questions. Onoda's version was extreme in its duration and its physical circumstances, which is why it remains compelling. But the underlying questions are familiar to anyone who has held a belief for a very long time and then been confronted with evidence that challenged it. The Lubang jungle still exists. The island is still there, in the Sibuyan Sea, its interior still green and dense and breathing. The hills where Onoda moved for 30 years are still covered in the same kind of forest, though the specific trees have changed, the natural world turning over its generations in ways that take longer than human attention usually notices. The streams still run down from the interior to the coasts. The birds still call in patterns that have been essentially unchanged for thousands of years. The rain still comes in the wet season, in the heavy afternoon downpours that the mountains pull from the humid Philippine air. Somewhere in that jungle, there are places where Onoda slept. Places where he made his fires, small and smokeless, the kind of fire that gives heat without betraying position. Places where he read the leaflets that told him the war was over and concluded they were propaganda. Places where he buried Kozuka after 1972 and found himself alone for the first time. Those places are unmarked by any sign. The forest has grown over them and through them and around them in the way that forests do, absorbing the human trace back into the general green. In Japan, Onoda's nature school continued its work after his death. The programs he established, designed to bring young people into contact with the natural world and develop in them the capacities for endurance and self-reliance that he believed modern life was eroding, continued under new leadership. This is perhaps the most quietly hopeful part of the legacy that the years in the jungle, for all their tragedy and their cost, eventually produced something that benefited others, that the extreme knowledge of the natural world that Onoda had acquired at such enormous personal price was transmuted into something useful and life-giving. He was given a military funeral in Japan. The ceremony was attended by former military officials and public figures and people who had been moved by his story. His memoir was still in print in multiple languages. His name had become one of those names that appear in discussions of human endurance and military loyalty in the psychology of belief, not always comfortably, but persistently, because the questions his life raised had not gone away. The Onoda Nature School bears his name and carries something of his conviction that human beings need contact with difficulty and with the natural world, that the capacity to endure is a form of wisdom, that young people deserve to be taught not only the skills of the classroom but the skills of the earth. These ideas are not without criticism, the history attached to them is complicated, and the philosophy that produced Onoda's endurance was the same philosophy that caused tremendous harm. But the ideas themselves, separated carefully from their most harmful expressions, contain something valuable: the capacity to be uncomfortable and remain present. The capacity to navigate by what is real rather than what is convenient. The capacity to find meaning in the physical world rather than only in the abstract one. These are things that any era can use. There is a final image I want to offer you before we let the story rest. It is not a dramatic image. It is quiet, and it asks you to hold it gently. Imagine Hiroo Onoda on the day he surrendered, standing in the jungle of Lubang Island with his rifle laid down and his former commanding officer reading the orders he had waited 3 decades for. He is 52 years old. He is wearing a uniform he has maintained through 30 years of jungle survival. The forest is all around him. The air is warm and heavy with moisture and the smell of green things. Birds are calling somewhere above in the canopy. The light comes through in the way it always comes through in deep forest, filtered and dappled and changing with every small movement of the leaves. He knows this light. He has lived inside it for 30 years. He knows every quality of it, every way it shifts through the day, every color it turns as the sun moves across the sky. He knows the sounds of this forest with a precision that no one else alive possesses. He knows the smell of the wet earth after rain, the specific texture of the bark of the trees he has slept against, the exact temperature of the streams at different points in the season. This knowledge is his. It cannot be taken away by the fact that the war was over. It cannot be dissolved by the discovery that his certainty was misplaced. It is the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of paying attention to a living world, and it is real, and it is his. He picks up his rifle from the ground, not to use it, but to carry it, because it must be formally surrendered rather than simply left. He follows Major Taniguchi out of the trees. He steps from the shadow of the forest into the light of the open. And the world that has been waiting for him, complicated and changed and full of things he does not yet know, receives him quietly. Closing meditation. The jungle is very quiet now. The birds have settled into their evening silences, and the trees stand close together in the cooling dark, and somewhere in the distance, the sea breathes against the shore of the island in a rhythm older than any human story. Let your body settle into wherever it is resting. Feel the weight of your arms, your legs, the back of your head against whatever holds it. Feel your breathing slow, the way all breathing slows when the day is finally done. You have been carried tonight through 3 decades of green shadow and profound human commitment. You have moved through history slowly and carefully, the way history deserves to be moved through when it contains this much complexity, this much loss, this much strange and difficult beauty. The story of Hiroo Onoda is not a simple one, and you do not need to make it simple. You can carry its complications lightly, the way the forest carries the stories of everything that has happened within it, quietly, without judgment, without the need to resolve what does not resolve. The jungle holds all of it. The man who believed. The world that had moved on. The gap between them, and the long, long years of living inside that gap. You are not in a jungle tonight. You are somewhere soft and quiet. Let that softness hold you. let the quiet do its work. All the things that need to be done will wait for you. All the questions you are carrying will still be there in the morning, no more or less answerable than they are right now. Tonight they can rest. The Sibuyan Sea turns in the dark. The Philippine stars are overhead, the same stars that shone above the Lubang jungle on 30 years of slow nights. The world turns. The forest breathes. And you breathe with it, slow and deep, your chest rising and falling in the ancient rhythm of a body that knows how to rest even when the mind is still turning. Let the mind turn down. Let the images of the evening drift slowly apart, like leaves on a slow-moving stream, each one carrying something away, each one making space for the dark water of sleep to rise and cover the day quietly and completely. The jungle knows how to hold silence. You are learning the same thing. Slowly. Without hurry. Without any destination but this soft and welcome dark. Sleep, now. The forest is all around you. And it is very, very still. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.